right, so buckle up because we're diving headfirst into some seriously intense history today. Second Book of Kings. And let me tell you, this isn't just some ancient history lecture. This book is packed with enough political drama and divine intervention to rival any modern thriller.
Oh, absolutely. It's like Game of Thrones meets, well, God. But what really grabs you is how it wrestles with these huge questions about God's role in the world, especially in the messy arena of politics.
Right, like it's not giving us some neat little theology textbook. It's throwing us right into the fire with these wild stories that make you think, hold on, did that really just happen?
Exactly. And to help us unpack all this, we've got Jacques Ellul's The Politics of God and the Politics of Man. This guy, he really gets into the nitty-gritty of how divine power and human choices collide.
Yeah, Ellul doesn't mess around. So speaking of not messing around, let's talk about Elisha. I mean, this isn't just some prophet chilling out in the wilderness, right? This guy is a political powerhouse. We're talking regime change, serious influence. He's like the ultimate power broker with a direct line to, well, you know.
It's true. He's not just preaching about being good. He's right there in the thick of it, showing how God is active in even the most ruthless political struggles. Makes you wonder how we're supposed to understand God's role in today's crazy political landscape.
No kidding. It's definitely not as simple as saying, God's on my side, is it?
And speaking of complicated, let's jump into the story of Naaman. This guy is a big shot Syrian general at the top of his game, and bam, leprosy hits him.
And what's wild is that his healing, it's not some big show. He doesn't even meet Elisha face to face. It's all very, well, unusual.
Total curveball. This powerful general, used to everyone bowing down to him, is told to go humble himself before some prophet from an enemy nation. And get this, it's all because a young Israelite slave girl suggests it. Talk about an ego check.
And this is where Ellul's insights are so on point. He's like, look, God often works through the most unexpected people and events. Those little cracks in our tidy little worldviews, that's where God's power shines through in the most surprising ways. Even a young slave girl's words can be part of something huge. It really makes you think twice about those coincidences in life, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like maybe there's more going on than we realize. Okay, so Naaman, he swallows his pride, goes to see Elisha, and what happens? He's told to go take a bath in the Jordan River 7 times. Not exactly the miracle cure he was expecting, I'm guessing?
Not even close. He's outraged at first. I mean, he's expecting some grand display of power, not a prescription for a dip in the river. But Ellul points out that this absurdity, this unexpectedness, it's crucial. It forces us to let go of control, to admit that God's ways are bigger than our ways.
I love that. So Naaman finally gives in, takes the plunge, and bam, healed. But then things get even more interesting, don't they? This powerful general, now a believer in the God of Israel, has to go back to his pagan world and figure out how to make sense of it all.
Right, like how do you reconcile your faith with the demands of your political life, especially in a context where those two things clash? He even talks about how his position will require him to go through the motions of worshiping Rimmon, the Syrian god, even though he doesn't believe in it anymore. He's basically asking Elisha for permission to, compartmentalize, to practice what's called mental reservation.
Okay, hold on. Mental reservation. That sounds like walking a tightrope over, well, hypocrisy.
Yeah.
How do you even begin to draw the line there?
It's tricky, right? And Ellul doesn't pretend it's easy. But what's fascinating is how Elisha reacts. He doesn't condemn him, doesn't give him some simple answer. He just leaves it open, like he's acknowledging that tension between faith and the political game.
Yeah. It's not the kind of black and white answer we're used to today, that's for sure. It makes you wonder how often those clear-cut answers are just us trying to avoid the hard questions. Kind of like what we see with King Joram, right?
Oh, Joram. Talk about stuck between a rock and a hard place. He's the one dealing with that horrendous famine in Samaria. Remember, people are resorting to cannibalism. If that's not a political pressure cooker, I don't know what is.
Seriously. How do you even govern when your kingdom is literally eating itself? So how does Joram handle it? Does he step up, take charge, try to find solutions?
Well, that's the thing. He seems totally paralyzed by the whole situation. He's all about the drama, tearing his clothes, wearing sackcloth, repenting of a storm, like he's putting on a performance of piety.
Okay, so he's got the suffering servant act down, but is he actually doing anything to fix the problem?
Yeah.
Making policies, looking for help, anything practical like that?
That's just it. He's all talk and no action. Lots of lamenting and praying, but no real leadership.
And what about Elisha? You'd think the prophet would be the one offering some divine guidance, maybe whip up a miracle or two to get him out of this mess.
He does, but not how you'd expect. And honestly, it gets a little uncomfortable. See, Joram, in all his despair, he turns on Elisha, blames him for the famine.
Whoa, seriously? Blaming the prophet because your kingdom is starving? That's next level, even for a king under that kind of pressure.
It's extreme, for sure. But it shows us something important about how Joram sees God. Like, God's actions are directly tied to how well Joram is performing as king.
Right.
If I'm failing, he thinks, God must be punishing me for not being good enough.
So it's like he's holding God hostage to his own expectations. Get me out of this mess, or you're not the God I signed up for.
Exactly. And this is where we bump into Ellul's whole idea of free determination of man within the free decision of God. Basically, he's saying that God isn't some cosmic vending machine where we put in our good deeds and get what we want. God has his own purposes, and they're often way beyond our limited understanding.
So even though Joram is the king, God's supposedly chosen leader on earth, his actions don't dictate how God responds.
Nope. God's not obligated to jump just because we say jump. But here's the amazing thing. God still delivers Samaria from the famine, and he does it in the most unexpected way imaginable.
Right. Those lepers who stumble on the abandoned Syrian camp, leading to that whole miraculous end of the siege. It's almost comical. These outcasts, the ones considered unclean and pushed to the fringes, they become the instruments of God's deliverance.
Exactly. And Ellul points out these lepers aren't acting out of some deep piety or spiritual wisdom. They're just trying to survive, following their instincts. Yet their actions, insignificant as they seem, end up fulfilling God's plan.
It's like we don't have to have it all figured out to be some kind of spiritual giant, to be part of something bigger. Sometimes just showing up and doing the next right thing, that's enough. But okay, we've got a king who's frozen by his need for control, and these lepers who kind of fall into being God's instrument. So where do we go from here with all of this?
It's like watching this incredible tapestry being woven from both sides, you know? God's working out his grand plan, even when we're over here trying to micromanage everything. And then those unexpected heroes, they just stumble right into their roles. It makes you wonder who else God might be using in ways we can't even imagine. Which brings us to Hazael, the king of Syria.
Hazael? Isn't he the one destined to bring all that destruction down on Israel? Turns into the ultimate bad guy.
Well, it's not quite that simple. Remember when Elisha goes to Damascus and tells Hazael he's going to be king? He also warns him about all the terrible things he's going to do to Israel.
Oh, right. And Hazael's all, "Ooh, me. I'm just a humble servant. Never." Like he can't even fathom becoming that kind of leader.
But of course, that's exactly what happens. He conquers all this territory, brings unimaginable suffering on Israel, even desecrates the temple in Jerusalem. Hazael really focuses on this moment. He's like, look, Hazael's not some puppet being controlled by God. He's got a choice. He gets warned about the consequences, but he still chooses ambition and violence.
So even though God knows what Hazael's going to do, even though it all plays into God's judgment on Israel, Hazael is still responsible. That's a tough one to wrap your head around. Like free will inside this bigger plan.
Exactly. Being part of God's plan doesn't let us off the hook for our choices. And that's something we're still wrestling with today, don't you think? Especially when it comes to politics. Can we justify anything to achieve what we think is right, even if it means getting our hands dirty? Where's the line?
It's the age-old question, right? Do the ends justify the means? But Ellul seems to be saying there's more to it than that. It's not just about achieving some outcome. It's about making choices that line up with God's character. Which makes me think to Jehu. Elisha appoints him to overthrow that whole corrupt dynasty, the house of Ahab. Talk about a political revolution. He doesn't hold back. Wipes out Ahab's entire family.
Oh, yeah. Jehu is one of those figures who keeps you guessing. He's driven by this zeal for God, definitely. But there's also this ambition, this hunger for power that runs through his story.
There it is again. God working through someone flawed, morally ambiguous, even violent, to accomplish his goals. It's like this constant theme in 2 Kings, isn't it? God using the most unexpected, even the most unlikable people to get things done.
It's true, and it really messes with our neat and tidy categories of good guys and bad guys. We want our heroes squeaky clean, our villains easy to spot. But 2 Kings throws all that out the window. It's like it's holding up a mirror to us, to all the ambition and power struggles and violence, and saying, this is the messy reality I work with.
It's unsettling, but also kind of reassuring in a weird way. I mean, let's be honest, our world isn't black and white either. We're surrounded by shades of gray, by leaders who make questionable calls, by systems that are far from perfect. And yet, somehow, God is still working in the middle of it all.
It's a powerful thought, isn't it? God's not waiting for us to figure it all out, to be these perfect instruments of his will. He's willing to work with us, even in all our messy, flawed humanity. Which brings us to Ahaz. His story really drives this home. He tries so hard to secure his political power, but he goes about it in all the wrong ways.
Oh man, Ahaz. That's a story for our times, if ever there was one. He's facing this threat from Israel and Syria, and he decides the only way to survive is to cozy up to the Assyrian Empire. Pretty standard political maneuvering, right? So Ahaz takes it up a notch.
Right. He doesn't just want a military alliance, he wants in with the Assyrian gods too. Even builds a replica of an Assyrian altar right there in the temple in Jerusalem. Talk about a culture clash.
Yes, such a jarring image, trying to blend the worship of Yahweh with these foreign gods. You got to wonder what he was thinking. Did he really believe he could control everything, keep everyone happy?
Maybe he thought he could play both sides, hedge his bets. But it feels like the ultimate betrayal, doesn't it? Turning your back on the God who chose you just to save your own skin.
It does. And it backfires big time. Like he traded away true security for some temporary relief and ended up making Judah even more vulnerable in the long run, which is such a contrast to his son, Hezekiah. That's where we see Ellul's ideas about God's sovereignty and human choice really collide.
Hezekiah is interesting because he embodies faithfulness even when everything's falling apart. He's facing an even bigger Assyrian threat than his father did, but instead of looking for another alliance, he turns to God. Starts these religious reforms, calls people back to true worship, puts his trust in God to deliver them.
And boy, does God test him. The Assyrians lay siege to Jerusalem, and their spokesperson, this guy Jacques, he delivers these speeches that are straight-up psychological warfare, trying to demoralize the people, make them believe God's abandoned them.
And it's scary how relevant those speeches still feel today, isn't it? It's the voice of cynicism that tells us faith is for fools, power is all that matters. The voice that whispers, just give up, why bother?
But Hezekiah, he shuts it down. He goes to Isaiah, seeks God's guidance, and God comes through. And it's not through military strategy or diplomacy. This sudden plague wipes out the Assyrian army. It's like God saying, don't tell me the odds.
Right. It's a reminder that God's ways are higher than ours. His thoughts are bigger. He's playing the long game, even when we can't see it. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the second book of Kings, what do you think? What are we supposed to take away from all these wild stories?
It's a lot to process, for sure. But I think Ellul helps us see that it's not just some ancient history lesson. These stories, they're still speaking to us today. They remind us that God is always at work, even when we don't see it, that we can't outsmart him or manipulate him with our political games, and that ultimately our hope isn't in our own cleverness, but in aligning ourselves with his purposes, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't make sense.
Perfectly said. It's a call to engage with the world, even the messy world of politics, not with naive optimism or cynicism, but with this grounded faith that holds on to both the complexity and the possibility. And as we step out of this deep dive and back into our own lives, I think the big question is this. If God can use even the most unlikely people and the most unexpected situations to accomplish his purposes,